The restaurant was full that night. The sound of cutlery and conversations mixed with the aroma of elaborate dishes, creating an atmosphere that should be comfortable, but for me was suffocating. Every step I took towards that table seemed to weigh more than the previous one. My heart, which once held love and trust, was now a furnace of anger and disappointment. There they were, she, my wife, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at me in ages, and he, her lover, displaying false confidence as if he knew he was untouchable. They didn't notice me right away. Their laughter echoed in my head like a hammer hitting memories of dedicated years, of promises exchanged, of shared plans. It all seemed like a cruel joke now. I stopped a few steps away. I could clearly see how she rested her hand on his, how her gaze shone in a way that I thought was reserved only for me. She looked up and saw me. The smile froze on her face, her eyes widened in a mix of surprise and fear. He turned his face then, with an expression that was somewhere between doubt and arrogance. I didn't wait for them to say anything. With a firm and decisive gesture, I took my ring off my finger and threw it on the table. The sound of metal hitting the surface echoed louder than anything else in the room. Silence took over the hall. Every gaze was fixed on us. Congratulations. You guys did it. Now keep it, I said, my voice filled with sarcasm and bitterness, as I pointed to the ring that glittered in the restaurant light. I expected a confession, maybe an apology, something that showed regret. But what happened was very different. She tried to mumble something, but the words died on her lips. He, however, was faster. You didn't need to make such a scene, he said, with a cold tone, as he took the ring and held it between his fingers as if it were a trophy. If you couldn't keep her happy, don't blame me for it. Those words were like a punch. I took a deep breath, trying to control the urge to react physically. The pain of betrayal was already unbearable, I didn't need to make things worse by losing control. Happy? I said, almost laughing, but my voice was hoarse. Do you really think this is happiness? Is this what you have to offer? Lies, betrayal and secret meetings. My wife finally found her voice. Please, let's talk about this, at home, she begged, her tone wavering between desperation and shame. But the time for private conversations had passed. I could no longer ignore the fact that our relationship had become a theater, and I, a naive spectator. At home? Where did this all start? Or was it somewhere else? In the room we shared? In the bed I bought for us? Where exactly did you plan to destroy everything we built together? The questions came out like arrows, each one heavier than the last, and I knew they wouldn't have honest answers. The people around started to whisper. Some looked at me with pity, others, towards them, with repulsion. But the show was far from over. He, apparently uncomfortable with the attention, stood up, trying to maintain a superior pose. Enough of this. You don't know how things are. Maybe you better accept that it's over. Accept that it's over. His words echoed in my mind like a challenge. I looked at my wife, looking for some reaction, something that would indicate that it wasn't true, that she regretted it, that there was still something to save. But all I found was silence. A silence that screamed louder than anything she could have said. It's over, I repeated, not as a question, but as an observation. I picked up my phone and showed a message I had received earlier from an unknown number. It was a photo of them, together, laughing in another restaurant. Someone had warned me, and now, I understood why. You didn't bother to hide it, did you? Not even to save appearances. And I still wonder, how long has this been going on? Weeks? Months? Or was our whole life a lie? Her expression changed. For the first time, I noticed something other than fear and surprise. It was guilt. Genuine guilt. But at that moment, it didn't matter. The apologies she might have wanted to make wouldn't be enough to heal what was broken. Nothing would be. You think you won, I continued, turning to him. But remember this, anyone who builds something on the rubble of dishonesty never has a solid foundation. Good luck with that. I looked at her one last time. And for you. I hope this is the start of something truly worthwhile. Because from now on, you are alone. I turned my back and started walking towards the exit, but something unexpected happened. One of the customers, sitting at a nearby table, recognized his lover. "Hang on," he said, standing up and pointing. "Aren't you the guy who went out with my friend's wife last month?" The tension in the air became palpable. I stopped, watching the scene with dark curiosity. He tried to deny it, but the client seemed to have enough evidence to expose him right then and there. The confusion increased, and suddenly, everything became clear. The man who destroyed my marriage had a pattern, and my wife was just another on his list of conquests. I left the restaurant, leaving behind the confusion that had started, but with one certainty, that night would be the beginning of a series of revelations that no one there was prepared to face. And the story, this was still far from over. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear, we never support any form of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal destroys lives and leaves deep scars. Get ready, because what comes next is a shocking story, full of twists and emotions that will keep your attention until the last second. Good story. The clock said 7 in the evening when Daniel closed his laptop, exhaling a tired sigh. He had spent hours finishing an important presentation for his company, work he hoped would open new professional doors. Despite his exhaustion, there was a lightness in his face. He was eager to call it a day, not just for the relief of having completed his chores, but for the prospect of spending a peaceful evening with his wife, Laura. Laura had always been Daniel's balance. She possessed a calm, radiant presence, the kind of person who seemed born to attract light wherever she was. His smile was captivating, and his ability to listen made anyone feel important. Married for almost a decade, Daniel felt he had found a life partner in her, someone who shared his dreams and ambitions. Together, they had overcome financial challenges, built a cozy home and established a routine that, although predictable, brought comfort. At that same moment, Laura was in the kitchen, preparing Daniel's favorite dish. She had a habit of cooking on days when he was busy, as a gesture of affection. Life wasn't perfect, but they had supported each other over the years, each carrying a piece of the other's weight. She believed that that kind of partnership was what made a marriage work. As Daniel went upstairs to change his clothes, he felt a slight shiver of satisfaction. He remembered how he had met Laura at a college event, when she was still studying visual arts and he was immersed in engineering projects. It was fascinating how two very different people could complement each other so naturally. He loved the way Laura saw the world, her sensitivity to the little things he often overlooked. At the same time, she admired the discipline and security he conveyed, even in the most complicated moments. Despite all this mutual admiration, the last few months had brought small changes. They were not clear ruptures, but small details that, in isolation, seemed insignificant. Laura started going out more with friends and dedicating herself intensely to her artistic work, exhibiting pieces in galleries and attending cultural events. Daniel, on the other hand, had delved further into his career, seeking promotions and taking on projects that kept him busy late into the night. These new dynamics had generated less time together, and deep conversations, previously a constant between them, became occasional. Still, neither of them saw it as a problem. It was easy to believe it was all just a phase, the kind of thing every couple faces eventually. That night, however, Laura was particularly thoughtful. As he stirred the sauce in the pan, his mind wandered. She remembered the first years of their marriage, the impromptu trips, the spontaneous laughter and the endless nights of conversations. He thought about how much he missed some of those things and how much the responsibilities of life had created invisible barriers between them. The love was still there, but something seemed out of place. She shook her head, as if to banish those thoughts. After all, this was a time to celebrate. Daniel had finished an important project, and she wanted him to know how much it meant. When he came downstairs, dressed in more comfortable clothes, he found the table neatly arranged. Candles lit, flowers in the center, the smell of homemade food filling the air. He smiled, surprised and grateful. "You always know how to turn an ordinary day into something special," he said, kissing her on the forehead. "It's the least I can do," Laura replied, trying to hide the slight discomfort that still hovered in her thoughts. They sat down, and as they ate dinner, they talked about trivial things, work, the new neighbor who had just moved in, the upcoming family reunion. The atmosphere seemed welcoming, but there was something about the pauses between speeches that indicated that they were both avoiding deeper topics. After dinner, Laura suggested watching a movie. They cuddled up on the couch, and for a moment, everything felt like old times. She rested her head on his shoulder, and Daniel put his arm around her, feeling a comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. However, even at that moment, there was a slight tension in the air, as if something was about to happen. As the film played, Laura felt her cell phone vibrate in her pocket. Discreetly, she picked up the device and read the message. An indefinable expression crossed his face, something between concern and hesitation. She quickly turned off the screen, without Daniel noticing, but the gesture didn't go unnoticed by her subconscious. His thoughts began to stray from the movie and the present moment. On the other side, Daniel was lost in a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. He hadn't noticed the little signs Laura gave, the subtle changes in her behavior. To him, she remained the woman he had fallen in love with, and the complexities that come with years of coexistence were just part of the package. But there was a blindness in this perspective, a confidence that prevented him from noticing the fissures that were beginning to form. Later, as the night came to an end and they were getting ready for bed, Daniel held Laura's hand and said, "Thank you for today. I needed this more than I realized." She smiled, but there was a weight in her eyes. He didn't notice, perhaps because he wasn't looking. It was easy to ignore what was hiding in plain sight when you had faith that everything was okay. As the lights turned off and the silence of the night settled in, everyone was lost in their own thoughts. Daniel fell asleep quickly, his mind already projecting the next day and the responsibilities that lay ahead. Laura, on the other hand, remained awake for a while longer, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand the confusion in her mind. In the days that followed, the routine continued, but the small signs intensified. Daniel began to notice that Laura spent more time on the phone, that there were moments when she seemed distracted, as if she were absent even though she was next to him. He tried to push away these sensations, convincing himself that it was just a figment of his imagination. But something, deep down, was beginning to worry him. Laura, in turn, seemed torn. She continued to play her role as a devoted wife, but there were times when her actions seemed mechanical, disconnected from any genuine emotion. There was an internal battle going on, something she still couldn't fully understand, or perhaps something she'd rather not face. This was the kind of scenario where small choices and omissions can create chasms. The intimacy that had once seemed unshakable was now teetering on uncertain ground, and both, in different ways, were beginning to realize it. But no conversation had taken place yet. Not a word had been said about what was really going on. And as life continued, a silent tension settled between them, slowly growing, like a storm gathering on the horizon. A storm that none of them knew was about to change everything. The following weeks brought a strange sense of imbalance to Daniel. There was something about the routine that seemed slightly out of step, something difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Laura was still present, as always, but her gestures were more restrained, her attention seemed scattered. Small, subtle changes, but ones that Daniel began to notice. He decided not to confront her right away. Maybe it was just a phase. He himself was distracted by work, maybe that was it. But like any relationship that has faced difficult times, there was an instinct, an intuition that whispered in Daniel's mind. He began to observe more, to notice the moments when Laura looked away during a conversation, the smiles without context while reading something on her cell phone, the last-minute solutions that came up, with explanations that, although plausible, sounded rehearsed. It was a pattern he tried to ignore, but the more he noticed it, the harder it became to pretend everything was normal. One night, as Laura was getting ready to go out on a date with her friends, Daniel casually asked, "Do you think you'll be back late?" She responded quickly, almost rehearsed, "Not much. Maybe 11. He nodded, but something about that answer bothered him. It wasn't the content, but the tone, a little more defensive than necessary. When Laura left, Daniel stayed in the room, the sound of the door echoing in his mind like a warning signal. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through social media, looking for distraction, but he couldn't focus on anything. The idea of calling a friend for an impromptu meeting crossed his mind, but he dismissed it. Instead, he decided to leave. "I had no destination in mind, but I needed air." He drove through the city, aimlessly, until he stopped in front of a cafe where Laura used to go. It was late, and the place was practically empty. He parked the car and stood there for a few minutes, thinking. It was an irrational gesture, he knew she wasn't there. But somehow being in that place seemed to bring clarity. There was something he needed to do, something that could no longer be ignored. The next morning, Daniel decided to open the conversation. Over breakfast, with the sound of the toaster in the background, he tried to sound casual. "Do you think we've been spending too little time together lately?" Laura looked at him in surprise. "I don't think so, do you?" He hesitated before responding. "Perhaps. I've been feeling like we're disconnected. I don't know, maybe it's all in my head." Laura smiled, but it was an empty smile. "You're working so hard, Daniel. Maybe we should plan something together. A trip, perhaps." He agreed, but inside he knew that it didn't solve what he was feeling. There was something deeper, something that wouldn't be cured by a weekend in an exotic place. In the following days, Daniel began to pay even more attention to details. Laura always seemed to be busy, even in the moments when she was physically present. He tried to ignore the growing discomfort, but the feeling that something was wrong continued to grow. One night, while Laura was sleeping soundly, Daniel sat in the living room and began to reflect on the past few months. He knew that if there was something to be discovered, he needed to be prepared to face it. It wasn't like him to be suspicious, but that persistent anguish consumed him. He looked at her phone, which was on the coffee table. For a moment he hesitated. It was a line he had never crossed before. But the doubt was greater than his own hesitation. When he unlocked his cell phone, his heart was beating fast. He scrolled through the messages quickly, but everything seemed normal. Until he saw a name he didn't recognize. The messages weren't explicit, but there was something about the way the texts were constructed that felt too intimate. Simple words, but they carried greater weight. "I can't wait to see you tomorrow. You were amazing today." They were phrases that shouldn't be there, in conversations that shouldn't exist. Daniel put his cell phone back, trying to process what he had just discovered. He wanted to believe that he was interpreting everything wrong, that there was an innocent explanation for it. But the pain in his chest said something else. It was as if the ground beneath his feet was slowly crumbling. The next day, Daniel decided not to confront Laura right away. He needed more answers before he could act. Over the next few days, he began to observe his patterns more closely, his departures, his schedules. There was something consistent that he hadn't noticed yet. Finally, on a Friday night, while Laura said she was going to an art event, Daniel decided to follow her. He didn't know what to expect, but he needed to know. He drove a safe distance, feeling a mixture of adrenaline and dread. When she stopped in front of a restaurant, her heart skipped a beat. He parked a little further ahead and saw her entering. A few minutes later, a man appeared, and they greeted each other in a way that left no doubt. Daniel stayed in the car, watching the scene unfold as if he were out of his mind. He knew he should get out of there, but he couldn't. Their laughter, their complicit gestures, everything seemed like a direct blow to him. When he finally found the strength to get out of the car, he walked towards the restaurant, each step feeling like it weighed tons. He walked in, and there they were, at a table in the corner, completely absorbed in each other. For a moment, Daniel thought about simply leaving, pretending he hadn't seen anything. But anger took over. He approached, and when they finally noticed him, the smile disappeared from Laura's face. She tried to say something, but he didn't have time. He took off his ring and threw it on the table, his voice full of pain and indignation. "Congratulations. You guys did it." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Everyone's eyes were on them, but Daniel didn't care. He looked at the man, who was now trying to maintain a facade of confidence, but who was clearly uncomfortable. "I hope she treats you better than she treated me," he said, before turning and leaving. Outside, the air felt suffocating. Daniel felt the weight of what had just happened, but he also knew that this was just the beginning. Something about that meeting bothered him even more than the betrayal itself. Something he still couldn't fully understand, but it would soon become clear. Daniel sat on the sofa at home, the surroundings completely silent, except for the ticking of the clock. He had spent the night awake, trying to understand what had happened. The images of the restaurant still lingered in his mind, Laura's expression when she saw him, the obvious discomfort of the man sitting next to her. It was like a movie that repeated itself over and over again, but without a clear ending. He wanted answers, he needed them, but most of all, he wanted to know what had driven the woman he loved to destroy everything they had built. When the front door opened, the noise made his heart race. Laura entered, her steps hesitant, her eyes downcast. There was a tension in the air that felt like it weighed tons. Daniel didn't say anything. He just watched her as she closed the door, dropped her bag, and finally faced him. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. He nodded but didn't move. Laura sat in the armchair opposite him, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to find the words. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, looking at the floor. "But I think you deserve the truth." "Do you think so?" Daniel replied, his voice full of irony and pain. "Do you think I deserve it? Because, frankly, after what I've seen, I'm not so sure you know what it means to deserve something." She bit her lip, clearly trying to hold back the tears. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. I will not justify myself. What I did was wrong." "Wrong?" He leaned forward, eyes fixed on hers. "The wrong thing is to forget to pay a bill. That? This is a betrayal." "A betrayal, Laura. How do you call it wrong as if it were something minor?" She took a deep breath, trying to find the strength to continue. "I'm not going to lie to you. What happened was, it was real. I met someone, and things got out of hand. But it wasn't about you. It wasn't because I stopped loving you." "Ah, of course," Daniel replied, laughing bitterly. "You love me so much that you decided to betray me. It makes perfect sense. Why don't you just tell the truth? That I'm not enough for you, that you wanted something more exciting, something new, something more." "It's not that," she exclaimed, her eyes now shining with tears. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't even know how it all started. I just know that, somehow, I lost myself." "Did you get lost?" Daniel stood up, unable to contain his frustration. "And where was I while you were lost? Working to support this house. Trying to make plans for our future. Where was I, Laura?" She stared at him, the pain evident in her expression. "You were there, Daniel. Always has been. But that doesn't change what happened. And I'm not going to pretend that changes." He shook his head in disbelief. "So that's it? Are you just going to admit you cheated on me and expect me to move on? What kind of person do you think I am?" "It's not that," she said again, now in tears. "I want to fix this. I want to find a way to save what's left." "Save?" He laughed, but there was no humor in his voice. Laura, you destroyed everything. There is nothing to save. Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Laura looked at him, knowing there was something more she needed to say, something that could change everything, for better or for worse. Daniel, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you sooner. He stared at her, eyes narrowed. Ah, so there's more. What is it? Come on, Laura. I've heard enough to last a lifetime, what else do you have to destroy? She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she was about to reveal. The person, the man you saw, he's not just someone I got involved with. He is someone from my past. Your past? Daniel asked, confused. What are you talking about? Before we met, she began, her voice wavering, there was someone. Someone I loved very much. But things didn't work out, and we went our separate ways. I thought I would never see him again. But then he showed up again, and I don't know what happened. It was like a part of me that I thought I had buried came back to the surface. Daniel was silent, trying to process what he had just heard. Are you telling me this was all because of an ex-boyfriend? And that? It's not that simple, Laura said, her voice breaking. I never planned for this to happen. And as wrong as it was, I don't know how to stop it. He knows things about me, things I've never told anyone. Daniel frowned. What kind of things, Laura? What does he know? She hesitated, clearly struggling with herself to find the words. He knows, about the money. About what happened to my family. The money? Daniel took a step back, as if he had been struck. What are you trying to say? Laura closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Before we met, my family was broke. We lost everything, and I did things to survive. Things I'm not proud of. He knows about this, Daniel. He knows because he was part of it. Daniel felt like the ground was falling apart again, but this time in a different way. Are you telling me he was blackmailing you? And that? She nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't want to involve you. I thought I could solve it on my own. But I was wrong. Everything got out of control. Silence fell again, but this time it was different. There was something deeper, darker, that Daniel knew hadn't yet been revealed. He stared at her, his mind spinning with possibilities. What else, Laura? What else didn't you tell me? She didn't respond immediately, but when she finally spoke, her words were like a final blow. He won't stop, Daniel. And now he knows about you. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The betrayal had been painful, but now he realized he was involved in something much bigger, something that could change their lives forever. And as he stared at Laura, he knew that whatever came next would be even more devastating. Daniel felt his blood run cold upon hearing Laura's last words. He stood still, trying to assimilate what that meant. The initial anger that consumed him was slowly being replaced by a mix of disbelief and fear. He realized that Laura's betrayal was not just a relationship issue, but something much deeper, an enigma that had not yet been completely revealed. What do you mean, he knows about me? Daniel finally asked, his voice firm but with a hint of nervousness. What are you trying to say? Laura looked up, her eyes still teary, but now with something more, a desperate urgency. I didn't want you to get involved in this, Daniel. I swear I tried to keep you away, but he found out about your promotion, about the money you've been getting. He thinks he can use this against me. He knows I would do anything to protect you. Daniel took a step back, his mind spinning. Protect from what, Laura? Of what, exactly? Because as far as I know, you were having dinner with him, and it didn't seem like you were being forced into anything. You don't understand, she clasped her hands, trying to hold back the tears. He didn't appear in my life by chance. He found me on purpose. He knows about everything, about the money my family lost, about what happened next. And now he thinks he can manipulate me, that I will continue to obey because he has this information. Daniel closed his eyes, trying to maintain control. Are you telling me he's blackmailing you? Using your past against you? And your response was to get involved with him? I didn't get involved with him because I wanted to. Laura stood up, her voice finally gaining strength. I was trying to keep you calm, Daniel. He threatened to expose things that could end my life, and yours too. Do you know what that would mean for us, for everything we've built? I'm not the person who lied and put me in this situation, Daniel replied, his voice firm. You could have trusted me. We could have faced this together, but instead you did it all alone and ended up destroying what little we had left. Laura collapsed onto the couch, her shoulders shaking as the crying took over. I was scared, she murmured. Fear of losing you. Afraid that you wouldn't forgive me if you knew everything. I thought I could control the situation, but I couldn't. He's dangerous, Daniel. You have no idea what he is capable of. Daniel ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. He needed answers, he needed to understand the depth of that problem before making any decision. Tell me everything, Laura. No half-truths. Who is this man? What does he want from you? And how did that put us in this position? Laura took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. His name is Victor. I met him before I met you. At the time, my family was on the verge of bankruptcy, and I was desperate to help. He presented himself as someone who could solve our problems, and for a while, it seemed like he could. But all he did was put me in even deeper debt. He controlled everything, kept me under constant pressure. When my family lost everything, he disappeared. And now he's back, Daniel added, his voice full of disdain. Let me guess, he wants money. Laura nodded, her face marked by despair. He knows about what you gain from your work, and he thinks he can use it against us. He said that if I didn't cooperate, he would expose secrets that would ruin not only me, but you as well. And you decided to deal with this alone, Daniel said, crossing his arms. And part of your plan was to sit with him in a restaurant, as if you were old friends? I had no choice. Laura replied, her voice cracking with tension. He called me to that meeting and made it clear that, if I didn't go, he would show up at our house. I was trying to buy time, Daniel. Trying to find a way out. Daniel was silent for a long moment, thoughts passing by like a whirlwind. He didn't know what was harder to accept, the betrayal, the lies, or the fact that they were now trapped in a game rigged by someone he had never heard of before that night. And what do you expect me to do now? Daniel asked finally, his voice cold. Forget all that? Pretend I didn't see you with him? Or do you want me to step into this chaos and try to fix what you destroyed? I don't know, Laura admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I just know that I need you, Daniel. I need you now more than ever. He laughed, but there was no humor in his expression. Do you need me now? Now that your lie has fallen apart? Now that you can no longer hide what you were doing? Is that what you mean? Before Laura could respond, the sound of a notification on her cell phone broke the silence. She looked at the device, and the expression on her face instantly changed to panic. Daniel noticed and, without thinking twice, took the phone from her hand. It's him, isn't it? He stared at the screen, where a new message from Victor had appeared. Let's see what he has to say. Laura tried to take it back, but Daniel pushed her away. He opened the message and read aloud, I hope our conversation was enlightening. Don't forget what we discussed. Otherwise, I can guarantee that Daniel will discover the truth in an even more painful way. Daniel threw his cell phone on the sofa and looked at Laura in disbelief. Is this what you call controlling the situation? Laura burst into tears again, but Daniel no longer knew whether he felt anger, sadness, or pure exhaustion. He needed to think, he needed to find a way to deal with this. But most of all, I needed to understand how far Victor was willing to go, and what he really wanted. As Daniel left the room, leaving Laura alone, one thing was certain, that story was far from over, and he would do whatever was necessary to protect them, even if it meant facing the worst. Daniel left the house with quick steps and a clouded mind, Laura's cell phone still clutched in his hand. He didn't know where he was going, but he needed air, space, some kind of clarity. The night was cold, and the silence of the streets made the weight in his chest feel even more crushing. He couldn't go back. Not at that moment. Not while all the emotions were boiling inside him, conflicting and intense. He stopped in an empty park, sitting on a wooden bench that felt as cold as his thoughts. He leaned back, looking at the starless sky, trying to understand how his life had gotten to this point. Laura's betrayal, as devastating as it was, now seemed to be just the tip of a much larger iceberg, a web of secrets and manipulations that he never imagined could exist in his life. Victor's message still echoed in his mind. It wasn't just the threatening tone, but the implicit control he exerted over Laura. It was obvious that she was terrified, but it was also clear that there was something more. There was a part of the story that Laura hadn't yet told, something that Daniel needed to discover before he could make any decisions. He turned Laura's phone back on, scrolling through the messages exchanged with Victor. There weren't many, and most seemed purposefully vague. But in one of the oldest conversations, Victor mentioned a place, a hotel. "See you there, as always. Don't be late." Daniel felt a pang of anger as he imagined Laura going to this place again and again, but he suppressed the feeling. This wasn't about anger, not now. It was about answers. Daniel decided he had no more time to waste. He got up, got into the car and drove towards the aforementioned hotel. He didn't know what he would find, but he needed to confront Victor, understand what he knew, what he wanted, and why he was willing to destroy their lives to get it. The trip was short, but every second seemed to stretch endlessly. When he arrived, the hotel was exactly what he imagined, discreet, almost anonymous, the kind of place where unwanted encounters could go unnoticed. He entered the reception, his posture tense but determined. The attendant looked at him with a neutral look, typical of someone who sees all types of situations and doesn't ask questions. "I'm looking for Victor," Daniel said, his voice firm. "He often comes here." The attendant hesitated for a moment before responding. "We are not in the habit of disclosing information about our guests, sir." Daniel placed Laura's cell phone on the counter, displaying the message that mentioned the hotel. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "But this is important." "Where is he?" The attendant looked at the phone, then at Daniel, and finally sighed. "Room 212. He arrived early today." Without saying anything else, Daniel walked up the stairs, each step carrying a mixture of determination and uncertainty. When he reached the second-floor hallway, he saw the door marked with the number 212. He took a deep breath, trying to control the adrenaline that was pulsing through his veins, and knocked hard. The door slowly opened, and there was Victor, exactly as Daniel had imagined him, confident, with a smile that seemed designed to provoke. "Well, well," said Victor, crossing his arms. "I figured you would end up coming. Come in, let's talk like adults." Daniel entered, closing the door behind him. The room was simple but organized, as if Victor was just passing through. "I want answers," said Daniel, getting straight to the point. "What do you want with Laura? What do you really want from us?" Victor laughed, a cold, condescending sound. "Do you really think it's that simple? Laura and I have a history, Daniel. A story you clearly don't know." "I know enough," replied Daniel. "Enough to know that you have been manipulating and threatening my wife. So tell me, what do you really want?" Victor leaned against the wall, eyes assessing Daniel as if he were a participant in a carefully contrived game. "What I want, Daniel, is justice. Laura has made choices in the past, choices that cost me a lot. And now, I'm just balancing the scales." "Justice?" Daniel almost laughed at the irony. "You call that justice?" Manipulating a woman who is already terrified, destroying a marriage. This is not justice. It's revenge. Call it what you want, said Victor, his tone now more serious. But the truth is that Laura knew this day would come. She knew she couldn't escape forever. Daniel took a step forward, anger now evident in his stance. I'm not an easy man to intimidate, Victor. And if you think you can use my past or hers against us, you're sorely mistaken. Victor narrowed his eyes, his smile fading. Do you think this is about bullying? You really believe you know everything, don't you? Let me tell you something, Daniel. Laura told you her version, but the truth is that she is not the victim you imagine. Daniel felt a knot in his stomach, but he kept his expression firm. What are you trying to say? Victor grabbed a folder from one of the bedroom's furniture and threw it on the table between them. Here is the truth. Read. And then tell me if you still think she is who you think she is. Daniel hesitated, but opened the folder. There were documents, photos, records that painted a portrait of Laura very different from the one he knew. He felt like the ground was crumbling again, but now in an even deeper way. He closed the folder, unable to continue. I'll tell you this once, Daniel, said Victor, crossing his arms again. Laura is not innocent. And if you stay by her side, it will destroy you too. Daniel looked at Victor, his mind spinning with the new information. He needed time to think, to process everything he had just discovered. Without saying anything else, he picked up the folder, turned and left the room, feeling the weight of the revelations pressing down on his shoulders. As he walked down the stairs, he knew that the confrontation with Laura would be inevitable, and that the decision he would make could change their lives forever. Daniel returned home with a closed face and a heavy heart. The silence in the room seemed to scream in his mind, charged with everything that had happened in the last few hours. Laura was sitting on the sofa, her hands clasped, her eyes swollen from crying. She stood up as soon as she saw him enter, but hesitated when she noticed his expression. He held the folder with the information that Victor had given him, and that spoke more than any words that could come out of his mouth. You went to him, Laura said, her voice shaking. I knew you would. Of course I was, replied Daniel, coldly. Do you think I would wait for more lies? I needed answers. And now I have. Laura took a step forward, but he raised his hand, signaling her to stop. I don't know what Victor told you, she began, her voice full of desperation. But I can explain. Daniel interrupted, laughing humorlessly. What do you want to explain to me, Laura? That he wasn't lying? That everything in that folder is true? Because honestly, I don't know what's real when it comes to you anymore. Laura tried to speak, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Daniel placed the folder on the table between them and looked directly at her. You knew this was going to happen, didn't you? From the beginning. You knew this man would come back, you knew he had something against you. But instead of trusting me, you chose to deal with this alone, and look where we are now. I was trying to protect you, Laura said finally, her eyes filling with tears. I knew that if you saw what was in that folder, you would never forgive me. And you were right, Daniel said, his voice thick with hurt. I don't know if I can forgive this, Laura. I don't even know who you are anymore. Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. Laura sat down again, defeated, while Daniel remained standing, looking at the folder as if it were a symbol of everything that had fallen apart between them. He wanted to scream, he wanted to break something, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. Victor won't stop, Daniel said finally. He will keep trying to destroy us, trying to use what he knows against us. And you let it get to this point, Laura. You gave him that power. I know, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I know I messed up. But I still love you, Daniel. I still want to fix this. I don't know if this can be fixed, he replied, with brutal honesty. I don't know if I want to fix it. Laura started to cry again, but Daniel looked away. He could no longer bear to see her face, the face he had loved for so long, now filled with so many lies and deceptions. He picked up the folder again and left the room, going up the stairs to the bedroom. He needed to think, needed space to decide what he would do next. The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He knew he couldn't just ignore what had happened, but he also knew he couldn't allow Victor to continue to control their lives. He looked for a lawyer who specialized in situations like that and handed over the folder, explaining everything he knew. The lawyer assured that he could help, but warned that it would be a long and painful process. Meanwhile, Laura remained at home, a shadow of her former self. She tried to talk to Daniel several times, but he avoided her. He needed time to understand his own feelings, to decide if there was still something between them worth saving. Each day that passed felt heavier than the last, but he knew he had to move on, one way or another. Victor, on the other hand, didn't stay quiet. He tried to get in touch again, but Daniel was prepared. With the help of his lawyer, he managed to gather enough evidence to open a case against Victor for extortion and threats. It was a risky move, but Daniel knew it was the only way to end this once and for all. Months later, as the case against Victor progressed, Daniel finally made his decision. He and Laura sat down for one last conversation, each carrying the weight of their choices. "I never wanted it to end like this," Laura said, her voice full of sadness. "I just wanted to protect what we had." "But you destroyed what we had," Daniel replied, firmly. "And I don't know if I can live with that. I need something more, something that makes me feel whole again." She nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. She knew she had lost Daniel, she knew her choices had sealed their fate. But even so, there was a small hope that he would find happiness again, even if it wasn't with her. When the divorce was finalized, Daniel felt a strange relief mixed with sadness. He had lost something important, but he also knew he had gained the freedom to start over. He began to dedicate himself more to work, spend more time with friends, and eventually met someone who brought back the feeling of confidence and joy he thought he would never have again. Laura, in turn, decided to leave everything behind. She sold her house, moved to a smaller town and started working on something new. Despite the pain, she knew she needed to move on, one way or another. Victor was convicted of the crimes he committed, but his shadow still loomed over them both. Even so, Daniel and Laura learned to live with the consequences of their choices, each in their own way. And in the end, each of them found a path to start over, even if that path was full of scars and painful lessons. If you've made it this far, leave your thoughts on this story in the comments. Your opinions are very important to us. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal, but believes that each story can teach us something about the consequences of our actions. Until next time.